want to start with the three participants here in the Freedom Rides. And I want you to go back 50 years. And I want you to tell us what was going on in your lives that caused you to be motivated to take this extraordinary action. I mean, most people talk about it. Actually, most people don't even talk about doing anything. But the vast majority who talk about doing something don't ever get around to it. And you actually did it. I mean, this was, to say the least, extremely inconvenient. How did it happen? How did you make that decision? Dion?
I get first this time. As was stated, I'm from Petersburg, Virginia. Petersburg, at that particular time, was a totally segregated town, segregated school system, etc. Even before graduating from high school, I recognized what the state of races was. When I got to Howard University, the sit-ins started throughout the South Greensboro, etc. Washington, D.C. at the time was supposedly not a segregated town, but if you went across the Potomac River into Virginia, or across that imaginary line separating the district from Maryland, everything was segregated. We organized a group called the DC Nonviolent Action Group, and we conducted sit-ins in those cities, in Virginia and in Maryland. After that activity and the Freedom Rides started, I knew that that was merely a continuation of our involvement in civil rights activities like the sit-ins and picket lines, etc., and boycotts. It was no more than a continuation. Now, I would like to make very clear, I was not one of the persons who went on the initial Freedom Ride that ended in the burning of the bus. I guess I had an easy way out. When I joined, I expected it to be just as violent. I joined the ride in Montgomery, Alabama. This was just after the burning of the bus and also after Birmingham. And I joined the ride because I knew it had to be completed. My attitude was, perhaps because of my youth, I was 19 years of age at the time, and I keep referring to it as youthful exuberance. I'm not certain if I truly understood, I'm not certain I truly understood what violence was, but I knew what might happen, if that's not contradictory. But again, being in youth, I knew I had a family that I supported or anything of that nature. So I figured I could afford to continue my involvement in the civil rights activities. I sometimes, this is perhaps off the beaten path, but I sometimes wonder what my life would be like today had it not been for that experience. I don't know if that's the answer or a response that you might be looking for, but yeah, I knew that this was no more, the ride was no more than an extension of the sit-ins and the picket lines, etc. I didn't fully know if I would return or not, but I had to be involved.
You felt compelled to do it.
I think that's a good word, yes.
I'm actually going to ask a follow-up question after we get through the panel about how this did change your future life. But let's go ahead and get Reginald here to describe his motivation, his memories.
I just want to make sure it's picking. Is this picking me up? Is this mic working?
Yes.
As you've learned from the introduction, I'm a native Washingtonian, and despite the fact that Washington, D.C., unlike Deep South, did not have visible signs saying colored, white as a distinctive situation. D.C. was as much segregated in a real sense as some of the cities in the South. So as a youngster growing up in Washington in the 40s, there were places we could not even play as African-American students. We could not go to certain schools. We could not swim in certain pools. We could not go to certain movie houses. You know, our parents were often relegated to the basement of shopping stores. And many of the African American women, for example, could not try on things the same way one that was not African American could. So there was evidence of a separate situation in Washington. So I always say that we become who we are based on those total experiences, relationships that we have as our life evolves. So as a youngster growing up in Southwest Washington with those kind of restrictions and knowing that we could not do certain things, that played a role, I'm sure, in what happened once I was thrust as a student at Virginia Union during the sit-ins as a result of what happened in Greensboro with the students and how that spread over the South and many of the campuses in the South. So as a student involved in the sit-ins, that sort of evolved into the whole situation with the Freedom Ride. So when I learned of, as many of us did, through newspaper articles, through television reports, about what happened just outside Anniston, Alabama, and the violence perpetrated through that whole experience and what was going on in Birmingham as well, the logical evolution for me was to find a way to be involved in the Freedom Ride. And thanks to a gentleman named Charles Farrar, who's in Albany, Georgia, but who was a part of SNCC as well. Charles was a graduate of Virginia Union, but a senior classman when I was there. He was trying to encourage students who would be willing to go on the Freedom Rides to go. And 3 students, a young man named Obadiah Sims, who's since been deceased, Raymond Randolph, and I decided that we would go on the Freedom Rides. And thus, I got thrust into the Freedom Rides, arrested on June 7th there in Jackson, Mississippi, Hinds County Jail. Later, as many of us transferred out to Parchment. So that's how I got involved in it. But I think, though, that my involvement came at a risk of not being able or not being willing to ask my parents about it, rather to go and let them discover later. But that's another story as part of my experience. But he mentioned about the thing with Marvin Gaye. I mention that because I think all that has something to play with us. That we had a little informal group in junior high school. I don't know, 7th through 9th grade. And it is true that I was the lead singer. Marvin was the first singer. And so when I later saw him in Richmond, in fact, as a professional singer, I thanked him for allowing me to help his career. I'll leave it at that.
That's wonderful. I know he was grateful. Joan?
Well, I think
Let's
specifically...
get that mic up there. We can turn it up, turn the volume up.
What are we doing? Are we there? Yeah. Okay. Specifically on the Freedom Rides, I was already involved with NAG and the sit-ins. That's Dion's group in D.C. And part of the nonviolent philosophy is if one person falls by the way or is shot by the British troops with Gandhi, another person steps up to take their place. Well, Hank Thomas, who you saw in the film, was part of our NAG group. And particularly when we saw him by that burning bus, we knew we had to go. And one by one, or 2 by 2, our group left to go down to the Freedom Rides. But what got me into the movement, I think, is growing up in Virginia with my family roots in the Deep South, and being in the schools in Virginia at the time of massive resistance, and I know the schools here were closed. I had classmates in high school who were a year behind because their schools had been closed and then they had been sent to live with relatives. We were very concerned that we would not have a high school to graduate from and then could not go on to college or get our good government job. And we had a lot of time to think about how did we feel about integrated schools and society on that topic in general, because we just wanted to get through high school. And for me, it was looking both at the Christian church, in as much as you've done it unto one of the least of these, my brethren, you've done it unto me, love thy neighbor as thyself, and the rest of it. And also the Declaration of Independence. We hold these, you know, that all men are created equal. We didn't learn too much about the Constitution because our state was in opposition to the Supreme Court. But we did learn about secession and the Declaration of Independence. I still don't quite understand how, if our Declaration of Independence upheld the right of secession, we were denied it to the southern states, you know, as a constitutional principle. But plenty of time to think about how we treat our fellow humans. And as a Southerner, I felt it was our job to make our part of the country what it should be, to live up to our highest ideals. It shouldn't be up to the Northerners to come down, you know, and do it try to do it for us. We had to take care of our own business. And that's what took me into the movement to begin with, to make the South a better place for all of us.
Joan, go ahead. Joan just mentioned the terrible state of massive resistance. For the students in the room who may not know about it, I hope you'll take time to look at the PBS film on massive resistance that was premiered at this film festival last year that the Center for Politics produced, the fall of massive resistance. And it's shocking when you see what people went through at that time just to go to school, and the closing of the schools, which did occur in Charlottesville and 3 other localities, including Jones Arlington. So take a look at that. It's well worth your time.